Hello! Welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Robert Hastings stared out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. The glittering skyline of Manhattan sprawled before him. His empire, Hastings Global Enterprises, was at the pinnacle of its power, dominating industries from finance to technology. Yet, despite the billions amassed, there was a storm brewing inside him, one that all the wealth in the world could not calm. His only son, Ethan Hastings, had delivered a blow that shook the very foundation of Robert's meticulously constructed life. The words still echoed in his mind, "I'm marrying Sarah, Dad. I don't care about the money, the legacy, or the expectations. I love her." Robert clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the crystal glass of scotch he held. Ethan's declaration had been more than defiance, it was a betrayal. Sarah Miller, a nobody from Chicago, had somehow ensnared his son, the heir to an empire worth billions. Robert had expected Ethan to carry the Hastings legacy forward, to marry someone of their status, someone who understood what it meant to stand at the summit of power. "Sir," came the voice of Robert's assistant, Julia, from the intercom. "Mr. Ethan Hastings is here to see you." "Send him in," Robert replied, his voice cold and deliberate. Ethan entered the room with an air of quiet determination. His tall frame, athletic from years of polo and tennis, seemed out of place in the casual jacket and jeans he now wore. Robert noted the absence of a tailored suit with a pang of irritation. "Dad," Ethan began, his tone calm but firm. "I came to say this face to face. I love Sarah, and I'm going to marry her. Nothing you say or do will change that." Robert studied his son, his steely blue eyes narrowing. "Do you even understand what you're throwing away, Ethan? The inheritance, the prestige, the access, everything that makes a Hastings who they are?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "What makes me who I am isn't money or your name. It's my choices, my values, and the people I love. And I love Sarah." Robert exhaled sharply, setting the glass down on his mahogany desk. He paced the room, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Love," he scoffed. "Do you really think love will sustain you when the bills pile up? When you can't provide for her? You've lived a life of privilege, Ethan. You have no idea what the real world is like." "I'm willing to find out," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. The tension in the room was palpable. Robert stopped pacing and turned to face his son. "Then you leave me no choice," he said, his voice a blade cutting through the air. "If you marry her, you're out. Out of the family, out of the company, out of the will. You'll be nothing. A nobody." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes burning with a mixture of hurt and resolve. "If being a Hastings means turning my back on the woman I love, then I don't want it." For a moment, Robert saw a glimmer of his younger self in Ethan, ambitious, stubborn, unwilling to yield. But where Robert had chosen power, Ethan was choosing something far more intangible. It infuriated him. "Get out," Robert snapped. "If you walk out that door, you're not my son anymore." Ethan hesitated, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. But then, without another word, he turned and left. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a definitive thud. Robert sank into his chair, staring at the door for a long moment. A part of him wanted Ethan to come back, to apologize, to promise to end the relationship. But deep down, Robert knew his son wouldn't. That evening, Robert dined alone in the opulent dining room of his Upper East Side mansion. The long table, capable of seating 20 guests, felt cavernous. The silence was broken only by the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. His wife, Margaret, had chosen to stay in their Hamptons estate, having grown weary of Robert's relentless obsession with control. He pushed the plate of filet mignon away, suddenly losing his appetite. The memory of Ethan's determined gaze haunted him. For years, Robert had molded his son, grooming him to take over the family empire. Ethan had excelled at boarding school, graduated at the top of his class from Harvard, and joined Hastings Global Enterprises, quickly proving himself as a natural leader. But Sarah Miller had disrupted everything. Robert had done his research on her. She was a schoolteacher from a working-class family in Chicago, with no wealth, no connections, and no ambitions beyond her modest profession. She was, in Robert's eyes, utterly unremarkable. He couldn't fathom what Ethan saw in her. Was it her humility? Her earnestness? Qualities that Robert had long dismissed as weaknesses? He shook his head, unwilling to entertain such thoughts. A week later, Ethan's departure had become a reality. His office at Hastings Global Enterprises was empty, his name removed from the official letterhead. Robert had signed the legal documents severing Ethan's financial ties to the family. The media buzzed with speculation about the estrangement, but Robert issued no statement, letting the rumors swirl unchecked. Margaret returned to the city, her demeanor cool and disapproving. "Was it worth it?" she asked one evening as they sat in the library. Robert looked up from his glass of bourbon, his expression hard. He made his choice. Margaret's lips tightened. "And you made yours. You've always valued control over connection, Robert. But you've lost your son. Do you even care?" Her words stung, but Robert refused to show it. "He'll come back," he said with more conviction than he felt. "When reality hits him, he'll realize the mistake he's made." Margaret sighed, standing up from her chair. "I hope you're right. But I fear the only mistake here is yours." As she left the room, Robert leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. Margaret's words lingered in the air, a bitter truth he wasn't ready to accept. Months passed, and the void Ethan left grew more pronounced. Robert buried himself in work, expanding the Hastings empire further, acquiring new companies and launching global initiatives. But no achievement filled the emptiness that gnawed at him during the quiet moments. One evening, as he reviewed quarterly reports in his study, Julia called him with an unusual request. "Sir, a private investigator is here. He has the information you requested." Robert's heart quickened. Weeks earlier, he had hired someone to find out what had become of Ethan. Though he refused to admit it aloud, he needed to know. The investigator entered, a middle-aged man with a pragmatic demeanor. He handed Robert a folder. "I followed your son for 3 weeks," the investigator said. "He's living in Chicago. Small apartment, modest lifestyle. Works as a mechanic. His wife is a schoolteacher." Robert opened the folder and scanned the photographs inside. Ethan, wearing oil-stained overalls, was smiling as he fixed a car. Another photo showed him with Sarah, the two walking hand in hand, their faces lit with genuine happiness. The investigator continued, "They don't have much, but they seem content. Well liked in their community. Your son has made quite the impression." Robert dismissed the man, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the photographs. The Ethan in those images wasn't the same polished, business-savvy young man he had groomed. This Ethan seemed free. For the first time, doubt crept into Robert's mind. Had he underestimated his son? Was it possible that Ethan had found something more valuable than the empire Robert had spent his life building? He closed the folder, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. Whatever Ethan had found, Robert couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity. It was time to see for himself. Robert Hastings's private jet touched down at O'Hare International Airport under a heavy blanket of gray clouds. The sharp contrast between the gleaming opulence of his aircraft and the gritty, unpolished city streets he soon found himself navigating was not lost on him. His black town car, chauffeured by one of his most trusted drivers, weaved through the bustling streets of Chicago. Robert peered out the window, taking in the vibrant, chaotic energy of the city. This was not his world. Here, there were no towering glass offices emblazoned with his family name, no pristine estates cordoned off from the public. Here, there was noise, movement, and a kind of raw, unfiltered life he had long left behind. The driver pulled up to a modest brick building in an aging neighborhood on the city's outskirts. A hand-painted sign reading, "Jefferson Auto Repair," hung above a garage with its doors open. Inside, mechanics bustled around, their hands stained with grease as they worked on a variety of vehicles. "Wait here," Robert instructed the driver as he stepped out of the car. His polished leather shoes clicked against the cracked pavement as he approached the garage. The air smelled of motor oil and rubber, a far cry from the sterile boardrooms he was accustomed to. Standing near a lifted truck was Ethan. His back was turned, and he was engrossed in conversation with a coworker, gesturing toward the engine. Robert froze for a moment, taking in the sight of his son in overalls, his hair tousled, his hands streaked with grime. This was not the Ethan he had raised, the Ethan who had worn custom-tailored suits and attended black-tie galas. And yet, there was something about the way Ethan carried himself that struck Robert. His son seemed, at ease, almost happy. Summoning his courage, Robert cleared his throat. Ethan turned, his smile fading as he recognized the man standing before him. "Dad?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with disbelief. The garage fell silent as the other workers took notice of the sharply dressed stranger. Robert felt their eyes on him, but he ignored them, focusing solely on Ethan. "Hello, Ethan," Robert said, his tone guarded. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, setting down the wrench he had been holding. "I came to see how you were doing," Robert replied, though the words felt inadequate. The truth was far more complicated, but he wasn't ready to unpack it just yet. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, his expression a mix of wariness and curiosity. "You've never cared about how I was doing before. Why now?" Robert hesitated. For all his business acumen, he found himself at a loss for words. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Ethan glanced around the garage. The other workers quickly busied themselves, pretending not to eavesdrop. Finally, he nodded. "There's a diner down the street. We can talk there." The diner was small and unassuming, with red vinyl booths and the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. Ethan slid into a booth, and Robert followed, feeling out of place in the humble setting. A waitress approached, pouring coffee into chipped mugs without waiting for an order. "So," Ethan began, leaning back in his seat. "What's this really about?" Robert took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. "I wanted to see for myself how you're living. To understand the choice you made." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You mean the choice to marry Sarah? Or the choice to walk away from your money?" "Both," Robert admitted. "You threw away everything I worked to build, Ethan. For what? A life of struggle? Working in a garage? Living in a tiny apartment?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I didn't throw anything away. I chose a life that's mine, not one you planned out for me. And for the record, I'm not struggling. Sarah and I are happy. We work hard, we pay our bills, and we're building something together." "Happy?" Robert repeated, disbelief evident in his tone. How can you call this happiness? You had the world at your feet. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You think happiness comes from money and power, but it doesn't. It comes from purpose, from the people you love. Sarah and I may not have much, but we have each other. That's more than I ever had growing up in your house. The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had provided Ethan with everything: luxury, education, opportunity. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had missed something crucial. The waitress returned, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan. He had ordered out of habit, and Robert noticed how easily his son interacted with the staff, thanking the waitress by name. Ethan seemed grounded, connected in a way Robert found unfamiliar. After a moment of silence, Robert spoke again. The garage, is it enough for you? Ethan's expression softened slightly. It's more than just fixing cars, Dad. Sarah and I are working on a project, something we believe in. We're developing a prototype for affordable electric vehicles. Cars that people like us can actually afford. It's not just a job, it's a vision for the future. Robert raised an eyebrow, surprised. Electric vehicles? That's an ambitious undertaking. Ethan shrugged. We've got a long way to go, but we're determined. We're funding it ourselves, bit by bit. Sarah's been helping with grant applications, and the community has been supportive. For the first time, Robert saw a glimmer of the ambitious, innovative spirit he had always admired in his son. But this time, it wasn't fueled by the Hastings name or fortune, it was Ethan's own drive, born from his own experiences. Why didn't you come to me with this? Robert asked, his voice quieter now. Ethan laughed bitterly. Would you have listened? You disowned me, Dad. Told me I was nothing without you. Why would I think you'd support me? Robert had no answer. The truth of Ethan's words cut deeper than he cared to admit. After leaving the diner, Robert walked back to the waiting car, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Ethan's life was far removed from the one Robert had envisioned for him, yet it wasn't the disaster he had anticipated. In fact, there was a certain strength in the simplicity and purpose Ethan had found. As the car navigated the streets back toward the airport, Robert glanced out the window at the city once more. For years, he had measured success in terms of wealth and power. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps he had been measuring the wrong things. For the first time in decades, Robert Hastings found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Robert Hastings sat in the dimly lit corner of his private jet, staring out into the inky darkness of the night sky as the plane ascended. His mind was in turmoil. The man he had just seen at Jefferson Auto Repair was a stranger. Gone was the polished, ambitious air he had spent years grooming, replaced by a mechanic with oil-stained hands and a conviction Robert could neither understand nor dismiss. The Ethan Hastings of today seemed more confident, more grounded, and, most disturbingly, happier than the son who had once stood by his side in boardrooms and charity galas. The flight back to New York was unsettlingly quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the engines. The usual satisfaction Robert derived from his success was absent. As the jet cut through the night, he replayed the conversation in the diner over and over in his mind. Ethan's words had been blunt, unflinching, and filled with truths Robert had been unwilling to face. His son had found something Robert had dismissed as trivial, a purpose beyond wealth. The moment he returned to his penthouse, Robert headed straight for his study. The walls were lined with shelves of meticulously organized books, biographies of great leaders, economic theories, and strategic guides that had shaped his empire. Sitting at his massive mahogany desk, he opened the folder the investigator had given him earlier. He laid out the photographs of Ethan and Sarah, scrutinizing each one. There was Ethan, his face illuminated with determination as he tinkered with an engine. Another photo showed Sarah standing at the steps of a school, smiling as she greeted children. Together, they were a picture of a life Robert could not reconcile with his own values. As the hours crept by, Robert found himself sinking deeper into introspection. He thought of his youth, long before Hastings Global Enterprises became a powerhouse. Raised in a modest home by a father who had worked tirelessly to build a small business, Robert had vowed never to live with such limitations. His hunger for success had driven him, but somewhere along the way, the pursuit of wealth had consumed him entirely. Ethan's defiance, his decision to reject that path, felt like a betrayal, yet there was an undeniable admiration mixed with his frustration. The next morning, Robert's assistant, Julia, found him still in the study. His shirt was rumpled, and his eyes carried the weight of a sleepless night. "Good morning, sir. Is everything all right?" she asked, carefully placing a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. Robert didn't respond immediately, staring at the photos of Ethan and Sarah as though they held the answer to a question he hadn't yet formulated. Finally, he looked up. "Julia," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Clear my schedule for the next 2 days. I need time to consider some things." Julia raised an eyebrow but nodded, accustomed to his abrupt shifts in focus. She left him alone, and Robert leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests tightly. For a man who had spent decades mastering the art of control, the realization that he might have lost control of the most important thing, his relationship with his son, was both foreign and terrifying. By midday, Robert decided he couldn't let things remain as they were. Ethan's mention of the electric vehicle project had intrigued him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the potential innovation, it was the audacity of it. Starting such an endeavor with limited resources required a vision and determination Robert couldn't ignore. Perhaps, he reasoned, understanding this project would help him understand his son's choices. That evening, he made a decision. He called one of his most trusted advisors, Victor Lang, a seasoned engineer who had worked with Hastings Global Enterprises on several technological ventures. "Victor," Robert began as the call connected, "I need you to look into something for me." Discreetly. "Of course, Mr. Hastings. What's the scope?" Victor's voice was sharp and professional. "My son," Robert said, pausing briefly. "He's working on an electric vehicle prototype. I want you to evaluate the viability of what he's doing. Find out if it's more than just a pipe dream." Victor didn't question the request, agreeing to investigate and report back within a week. Robert ended the call, feeling a flicker of anticipation. For years, he had operated with absolute certainty, every decision guided by logic and strategy. Now, for the first time, he was stepping into the unknown. Several days later, Victor returned with his findings. The report was delivered in a sealed envelope, which Robert opened with uncharacteristic haste. Inside were pages detailing Ethan and Sarah's work, the challenges they faced, the ingenuity of their approach, and the undeniable potential of their concept. "They're working with extremely limited resources," Victor explained as Robert skimmed the report. "But the foundation of their design is solid. If they secure proper funding and refine the engineering, it could be a game-changer." Robert leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against his lips. He felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Ethan was accomplishing something remarkable, yet he hadn't sought his father's guidance or resources. Why? Was it stubbornness? Or had Robert pushed him so far away that Ethan no longer believed his father could support him in anything other than the pursuit of wealth? That evening, Robert found himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. He thought of Margaret's words during their last conversation, her accusation that he had always chosen control over connection. Was she right? Had he built his empire at the expense of his family? For the first time in decades, Robert felt uncertain. The man who had dominated boardrooms and outmaneuvered rivals was beginning to see that power and money might not be the only measures of success. The next morning, he made another decision, one that surprised even him. He would return to Chicago, not as a businessman or a judge of Ethan's life, but as a father seeking to understand. He wasn't entirely sure how to approach the situation, but he knew one thing: if he didn't try, he would lose his son forever. The following week, Robert stood outside Ethan and Sarah's modest apartment building. It was a simple structure, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained. He had come alone, leaving his driver and entourage behind. The sound of children playing echoed from a nearby park, and the air smelled faintly of freshly baked bread from a bakery down the street. Taking a deep breath, Robert knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal Sarah. She froze, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Mr. Hastings," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "Sarah," Robert replied, his voice softer than usual. "I was hoping I could speak with you and Ethan." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with personal touches that spoke to the life they had built together. A stack of books on sustainable energy sat on the coffee table, alongside a small bouquet of wildflowers in a mason jar. Ethan appeared from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel. His expression hardened when he saw his father. "Dad," he said, his tone neutral but guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," Robert said. "Not about the past. About the future." Ethan exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded slightly. With visible reluctance, Ethan gestured for his father to sit. Robert took a seat on the worn couch, feeling uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I read the report on your electric vehicle project," Robert began, his voice steady but lacking its usual authority. "It's impressive." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "You had someone investigate us?" "I needed to understand what you're working on," Robert admitted. "And now that I do, I want to help." Ethan folded his arms, his posture stiff. "Why? So you can take over and make it another branch of Hastings Global?" "No," Robert said firmly. "I want to help because I see what this means to you. And because I realized something. Building an empire isn't the only way to leave a legacy." For the first time, Ethan seemed to waver. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her gaze encouraging. Robert saw in her eyes a strength and kindness that explained why Ethan had fallen in love with her. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," Robert continued. "But I want to prove that I'm here for the right reasons." Ethan studied his father for a long moment before finally speaking. "All right. We'll let you help. But on one condition: you don't control this. Sarah and I decide the direction, the terms, everything." Robert nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Fair enough." For the first time in years, Robert felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the resolution he had expected, but it was a beginning, and for now, that was enough. Ethan sat across from his father in the small dining area of the apartment, his arms still folded as Sarah quietly poured tea into mismatched mugs. The tension in the room was thick, an unspoken layer of mistrust settling between father and son. Yet, for all the discomfort, there was also a palpable curiosity. Ethan studied Robert with a mix of wariness and intrigue, trying to reconcile this version of his father, a man who claimed to want to help, with the figure who had cast him out months ago. Robert took a sip of the tea, barely masking his distaste for its lukewarm, bitter taste. He placed the mug carefully on the table and looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable. "I meant what I said," Robert began. "I'm not here to take over or control what you're building. I'm here to support you, on your terms." Ethan raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in his expression. "Why the sudden change of heart, Dad? You've never been one to care about anything that didn't align with your empire." Robert leaned back slightly, exhaling. "You're right. I've always measured success by numbers, profit margins, acquisitions, dominance in the market. But after seeing what you're working on and seeing you here, I realized there's more to legacy than wealth." He paused, his voice softening. "And I realized I don't want to lose you, Ethan. Not forever." Ethan's posture shifted slightly, his arms loosening as he exchanged a glance with Sarah. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, her calm presence grounding him. He turned back to Robert, his expression cautious but less rigid. "All right," Ethan said. "If you're serious about helping, we'll give it a shot. But let me be clear, this project is ours. We don't answer to Hastings Global, and we won't compromise our vision to suit your business strategies." Robert nodded. "Understood." And agreed. Sarah spoke for the first time since the conversation began, her voice steady and warm. "If you're willing to be a partner, not a commander, there's a lot you could contribute. Your experience, your connections, they could make a real difference for us." Robert turned his gaze to her, his expression softening. Sarah was nothing like the socialites or heiresses he had envisioned for his son, but there was an undeniable strength and intelligence in her that he couldn't ignore. "You're the one who helped write those grant proposals, aren't you?" he asked. She smiled faintly, nodding. "Ethan and I both worked on them, but yes, I handle most of the paperwork. My background in education helps with the communication side of things." Robert allowed himself a small smile. "You're resourceful. That's a rare quality." The compliment surprised Sarah, but she nodded politely. Ethan watched the exchange closely, his protective instincts still in play. "All right," Ethan said after a pause. "If we're doing this, we'll need a plan. Our prototype is still in its early stages, and we're short on resources, materials, equipment, even workspace. We've been using borrowed tools and favors from friends, but it's not sustainable." Robert's mind shifted into a gear he hadn't used in years, the strategic mode that had built his empire. "I can help with that," he said. "You'll need a proper facility, reliable suppliers, and capital to scale. I'll make some calls, but I want a full breakdown of what you need before I start." Ethan hesitated, his instinct to resist any form of reliance on his father still strong. But he also knew the reality of their situation. Without external support, their project would remain a distant dream. Finally, he nodded. "All right. We'll put together a list." Robert stood, adjusting his jacket. "Good. I'll expect it by the end of the week." Ethan rose as well, following his father to the door. "One more thing," he said, his tone firm. "This isn't just about the car. It's about what it stands for, making sustainable technology accessible to everyone. If at any point you try to twist this into another luxury brand for the elite, we're done." Robert turned to face his son, his expression serious. "I understand. And I give you my word, I'll respect your vision." Ethan studied his father's face for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. Satisfied for now, he nodded. "All right. Let's see where this goes." As Robert left the apartment, the cool Chicago night air hit him like a splash of water. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the modest building where his son lived. It was a far cry from the opulence of the Hastings estates, but there was something undeniably real about it. For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, hope. Over the next week, Ethan and Sarah worked tirelessly to compile their list of needs. Every night after work, Ethan would sit at the small kitchen table, sketching designs and noting the tools required for their completion. Sarah scoured grants and local funding opportunities, cross-referencing potential avenues to maximize their resources. The process was grueling but invigorating, a reminder of their shared commitment to the project. When the list was finally complete, Ethan sent it to Robert with a sense of trepidation. He half expected his father to reject their modest approach or demand changes that would align the project with traditional corporate strategies. But to his surprise, Robert responded with an efficiency that bordered on alarming. 2 days later, Robert called. "I've secured a warehouse in Chicago. It's not extravagant, but it has everything you'll need: space, security, and a location close to your community. I've also contacted suppliers for the materials you specified. They'll be in touch to finalize details." Ethan was stunned. That was fast. Robert's tone carried a hint of amusement. "I've built an empire by acting quickly, Ethan. If we're doing this, we're not wasting time." The warehouse was everything Robert had promised. Located in an industrial district on the city's south side, it was spacious enough to accommodate their growing needs without being ostentatious. When Ethan and Sarah toured the facility, their excitement was palpable. For the first time, their project felt tangible, as though it had stepped out of the realm of dreams and into reality. As the weeks went by, Robert became a steady, if somewhat distant, presence in their work. He attended meetings, provided guidance when asked, and ensured that the logistical side of the project ran smoothly. To Ethan's surprise, his father seemed to be keeping his promise to let them lead. Despite his initial reservations, Ethan found himself grudgingly impressed by Robert's contributions. For all his faults, his father had a mind like no other when it came to strategy and efficiency. And while their relationship was far from healed, there was a sense of progress, of cautious steps towards something resembling reconciliation. One evening, as they wrapped up another long day at the warehouse, Ethan turned to Sarah. "You think he's really changed?" he asked. Sarah smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "I think he's trying. And that's more than I ever expected." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the office where his father sat, poring over spreadsheets. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward, together. The warehouse buzzed with life, the clang of tools and the hum of machinery echoing off the walls. Ethan stood by a partially assembled prototype of their electric vehicle, its sleek frame an amalgamation of ingenuity and hours of painstaking effort. His hands rested on his hips as he surveyed the progress. Beside him, Sarah leaned over a schematic spread across a workbench, her brow furrowed in concentration. Across the room, Robert Hastings watched the scene unfold from the modest office overlooking the workspace. The transformation of this industrial space into a hub of innovation was undeniable. Workers, many of them local hires, moved efficiently, each contributing to the ambitious project. Robert was impressed, not just by the vision behind the car, but by the sense of purpose that filled the warehouse. It was something he hadn't felt in decades, not even within the walls of Hastings Global Enterprises. Ethan noticed his father standing above and gestured for him to join them. Robert descended the metal stairs with measured steps, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the casual, oil-streaked attire of those around him. "Thought you'd just keep observing from your ivory tower," Ethan said, a wry grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Robert smirked faintly. "Old habits die hard. But I'm here now. What do you need?" Ethan handed him a clipboard filled with notes and supply requests. "We're running into delays with one of the suppliers you set us up with. They're dragging their feet on delivering the battery components. Can you nudge them a bit?" Robert skimmed the list, already dialing his phone. "Consider it handled." As Robert stepped aside to make the call, Sarah turned to Ethan, her voice low. "He's been different, hasn't he?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes fixed on his father. "He's been helpful, I'll give him that. But I'm still waiting for the catch." "There's always a catch with him." Sarah gave him a knowing look but said nothing, returning to her work. Robert's call was swift and effective. Within minutes, he returned to the group. "The components will be here by Friday. I also suggested they waive the late delivery fees, given their delay." Ethan raised an eyebrow, reluctantly impressed. "Not bad. I'm not here to make things harder for you," Robert replied, his tone unusually soft. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the warehouse filling the air. It was Sarah who finally broke it. "We're close to finishing the prototype. The next step is getting it tested." Robert nodded. "Once the battery components arrive, how long until you're ready for testing?" "A week, maybe 2, Ethan replied. "It depends on how smoothly the assembly goes." "You'll need a controlled environment for the first test," Robert said. "I can arrange for a private track." Ethan hesitated, the weight of his pride pressing against the practicality of the offer. Finally, he nodded. That could work. For a fleeting moment, Robert felt a sense of accomplishment, not in his usual business sense but in the fact that his son had accepted his help without argument. As the days passed, the warehouse became a crucible of activity. Ethan, Sarah, and their team worked late into the night, fueled by coffee, determination, and the growing sense that they were on the brink of something extraordinary. The prototype began to take shape, a sleek, efficient vehicle designed to be both affordable and sustainable. Robert, though unaccustomed to the gritty, hands-on nature of the work, found himself drawn into the process. He often stayed late, reviewing financial projections or discussing potential investors with Sarah. She had a keen mind for detail, and Robert began to see why Ethan had fallen for her. Her practicality and vision balanced Ethan's passion, creating a partnership that was as effective as it was genuine. One evening, as the warehouse emptied out and the team trickled home, Robert lingered. He stood by the prototype, running a hand along its smooth surface. Ethan approached, a towel slung over his shoulder. "Don't tell me you're actually impressed," Ethan said, his tone teasing but not unkind. Robert turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent my life chasing the next big thing. Power, money, influence. But this," he gestured toward the car. "This is different. It's meaningful." Ethan leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "Meaningful doesn't pay dividends, Dad. That's your mantra, isn't it?" Robert smiled faintly, a hint of self-deprecation in his eyes. "It was. Maybe it still is. But seeing what you've built here, it's hard not to reconsider." Ethan studied his father for a long moment, searching for sincerity. "Why now, though? Why do you suddenly care?" Robert's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of years of estrangement pressing down on him. "Because I was wrong, Ethan. I thought I was protecting you by controlling everything, by shaping your future to fit my expectations. But I see now that I was only protecting myself, my legacy, my pride. I don't want to lose you over that." Ethan's jaw tightened, the emotions of the moment threatening to surface. He turned away, pretending to check something on the car. "It's going to take more than words to fix this," he said quietly. Robert nodded. "I know. But I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be." The day of the prototype's first test arrived, and the energy in the air was electric. Robert had secured a private track on the outskirts of the city, ensuring the team had ample space to put the vehicle through its paces. The sun shone brightly as the team wheeled the car out of the transport truck, its polished frame gleaming in the light. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, his face a mixture of nerves and determination. Sarah stood nearby, holding a clipboard and running through the checklist one last time. Robert watched from the sidelines, his usually composed demeanor betraying a hint of excitement. The first lap was slow and methodical, Ethan testing the steering, brakes, and basic functionality. With each pass, his confidence grew, and he began to push the car harder. The team cheered as the prototype hit its top speed, its electric motor humming smoothly. By the time Ethan pulled back into the pit, his grin was infectious. He climbed out of the car, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "It works," he said, almost disbelieving. "It actually works." The team erupted into applause, the months of hard work culminating in this triumphant moment. Sarah threw her arms around Ethan, laughing, while Robert stood slightly apart, clapping softly. As the celebration continued, Robert approached Ethan. "You've done something incredible here," he said. Ethan met his father's gaze, the tension between them easing ever so slightly. "We still have a long way to go," he said. Robert nodded. "Then let's get to work." For the first time in years, there was no trace of animosity in Ethan's voice when he replied, "Yeah. Let's." As the sun began to set, casting the track in hues of gold and orange, Robert found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with his son. The prototype glinted in the fading light, a symbol of everything they had built, not just the car, but the fragile, tentative bridge between them. For the first time, Robert felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with wealth or power. It was the pride of a father watching his son succeed on his own terms, and it was more fulfilling than he ever could have imagined. The months following the prototype's first successful test marked a turning point for both the project and the fragile relationship between Ethan and Robert. The sleek, innovative electric vehicle quickly gained attention from local investors and environmental advocacy groups, who were eager to support the mission of making sustainable transportation accessible to the average person. The warehouse became a hub of excitement, with reporters and industry insiders visiting to see the progress firsthand. For Ethan, the journey was exhilarating but exhausting. The long days of refining the design, preparing for presentations, and fielding investor interest pushed him to his limits. Yet, Sarah was always by his side, her steady presence anchoring him through the chaos. Robert, too, had become a fixture in their lives, not as a domineering figure, but as a mentor and supporter who respected the boundaries Ethan and Sarah had set. One crisp fall morning, Ethan stood before a crowded conference room at a clean energy expo in Chicago. On stage with him were Sarah and Robert, the prototype car gleaming under the bright lights. This was the moment they had been working toward, the official unveiling of their vehicle to the world. Ethan adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "Good morning, everyone. A year ago, this car was just an idea, a dream my wife and I shared to create something that could change the way we think about sustainable transportation. Today, thanks to the support of an incredible team and a community that believed in us, that dream is a reality." The audience erupted into applause as Ethan continued, detailing the car's features, the team's mission, and the journey that had brought them to this point. When he concluded, Sarah took over, highlighting the environmental impact and accessibility of their design. Finally, Robert stepped forward, his usual corporate polish softened by genuine pride. "When Ethan and Sarah told me about their vision," Robert began, "I was skeptical. I spent my life believing that success was measured in dollars and dominance. But this project taught me that true success is about creating something meaningful, something that makes the world a better place. It's an honor to be part of their journey." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Ethan found himself smiling at his father, not the tight, forced smile of old, but a genuine expression of gratitude. Later that evening, as the three of them celebrated at a modest dinner with their team, Ethan pulled Robert aside. "I didn't think we'd ever get here," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Neither did I," Robert said. "But I'm glad we did. You've made me proud, Ethan. Not because of the car, but because of who you are." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thanks, Dad. For everything." Over the next year, Ethan and Sarah's car went into limited production, attracting widespread acclaim. The project grew, but they remained true to their mission, resisting the temptation to turn their company into just another profit-driven enterprise. Robert, now a partner in the truest sense of the word, continued to support them while giving them the space to lead. For Robert, the journey was transformative. He found himself reevaluating not just his relationship with Ethan, but his entire approach to life. For the first time, he wasn't driven by the need to dominate, he was driven by the desire to contribute, to be part of something that mattered. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan and Sarah stood in the bustling warehouse, watching a new batch of cars roll off the assembly line, Robert approached them. "You've built something extraordinary here," he said. And it's just the beginning. Ethan smiled, his arm around Sarah. It's not just us, Dad. It's all of us. As the three of them stood together, the hum of progress filling the air, it was clear that this wasn't just a victory for their project, it was a victory for their family. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, redemption, and innovation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and click on the next video that's popping up on your screen right now, you won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.